Hello there, Mr. Martin's IB biology class. Take a look around you, maybe even just in your classroom for a second.
Yeah, think about all the different kinds of living things out there.
Totally, from like the plants outside to maybe even the bacteria you can't see. It's an amazing variety, isn't it?
It really is. Mind-boggling, actually.
And as you're digging into biology, this like huge question comes up. How did all this incredible diversity of life on Earth actually happen?
It's a really central question in biology. A big one.
And, well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today.
Yep, we're diving deep into a fundamental concept. Natural selection.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we've been looking through some of your biology course materials, no specific files, just the general stuff.
Right, just trying to get a really solid handle on this key process.
Our goal today is basically to break down natural selection, make it clear, engaging, help it stick, especially if English isn't your first language.
Absolutely. So by the time we're done, you should hopefully have a good grasp of a few key things.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, that natural selection is really the main engine driving how life changes over time. Evolution, basically.
Got it. The driving force.
Second, why differences, variation within a group is so important and where that variation actually comes from.
Ah, right. Things like changes in genes and reproduction.
Exactly. Mutation and sexual reproduction are the big ones there.
Okay, what else?
We'll also look at how many species, well, they produce way more offspring than can possibly survive.
Overproduction.
Right.
Yeah.
And how that leads to competition. For food, space, all that stuff, that really fuels natural selection.
And then there are those pressures, right, from the environment.
Precisely. We'll talk about those pressures. The non-living ones, abiotic, like temperature, and the living ones, biotic.
Including that really interesting one, sexual selection.
You got it. And crucially, why the traits that give an advantage must be passed down. Heritability.
Can't just be something you learned or acquired.
Nope. Has to be in the genes. And finally, we'll touch on some cool experiments. These ones by John Endler using little fish called guppies.
Sounds like a plan. Ready to jump in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What is natural selection, like in simple terms?
Okay, so the core idea is pretty straightforward. Within any group of living things, individuals aren't all identical, right? There's variation.
Right, differences.
And some of those individuals just happen to have traits that make them, well, better suited to their specific environment at that specific time.
Okay, so they fit in better somehow.
Yeah, maybe they can get food easier or hide from predators better or survive the heat better, whatever it is.
And because they're better suited?
They're more likely to survive, and crucially, they're more likely to reproduce, to have offspring.
Ah, okay, survival and reproduction.
Exactly. And they pass on those helpful traits, those advantageous genes, to their kids.
So the environment is kind of testing everyone out.
That's a great way to think about it, like a constant test. And over many generations, this whole process leads to a change.
A change
in how common those helpful traits, those advantageous alleles, are within the whole population. They become more frequent.
And that gradual change over time in the inherited characteristics, that's evolution.
That's evolution in a nutshell, driven by natural selection. The environment selects which individuals get to reproduce more, but it's not like a conscious choice.
Right, it's just the outcome of who survives and reproduces best in that situation. Like an editor, maybe, cutting out the versions that don't work as well.
Exactly, a strict editor. Yeah, I like that. And it's important to remember natural selection acts on individuals. It benefits the individuals that are better adapted right now.
Not necessarily the whole species.
Not directly, no. Think about lions. Maybe stronger lions take over a pride, get more food, have more cubs. Their stronger genes get passed on more.
Okay.
So the lion population might evolve to be stronger overall, but the selection pressure favored those specific stronger individual lions.
Okay, that makes sense. So for this editor, this natural selection, to even work, it needs something to choose from, right? It needs options.
Absolutely critical. That's where variation comes in. Without differences, selection has nothing to act upon.
Why is it so essential?
Well, think about it. If every single organism in a population was genetically identical.
Like clones.
Yeah, exactly. Then they'd all have the exact same chances of surviving or not surviving, reproducing or not reproducing when the environment changes or presents a challenge.
Ah, so no individual would be naturally better than another.
Precisely. Selection couldn't favor anyone. It'd be like trying to pick your favorite identical twin. There's no basis for choice based on their traits. Variation is the absolute bedrock.
Okay, so variation is key. Where does it actually come from? Our materials mention two main sources.
That's right. The first one is mutation.
Okay, mutation, like changes in DNA.
Exactly. Mutations are essentially random changes in the DNA sequence. Think of them like typos in the genetic instruction manual.
Random typos.
Totally random. These typos create new versions of genes, which we call alleles. Now, sometimes these new alleles might be beneficial.
Helpful.
Yeah, they might give the organism a slight edge. Sometimes they're harmful, disadvantageous.
Make things harder for survival or reproduction?
Right. And sometimes they're neutral. They
Yeah.
don't really have any noticeable effect either way, positive or negative.
And for evolution, it's the mutations in the sperm and egg cells that matter, yeah.
Spot on. Because those are the mutations that can actually be passed down to the next generation, inherited.
Got it.
And it's worth noting, for organisms that reproduce asexually without a partner mutation is pretty much their only source of brand new genetic variation.
Ah, okay. So that could be a limitation if the environment changes fast.
It can be, yeah, compared to sexual reproduction, which is the second major source of variation.
Right, sexual reproduction.
Right.
How does that create differences? It seems like offspring are usually similar to parents, but not identical.
Well, sexual reproduction is incredibly powerful at shuffling the existing genetic deck, you could say. It creates new combinations of alleles that parents already have.
Shuffling the deck. How?
It happens mainly during meiosis, that special cell division that makes sperm and eggs. There are a couple of key mechanisms. One is called crossing over.
I think I remember that. In prophase.
That's the one. Homologous chromosomes, the pairs you get, one from each parent, they cozy up and can literally swap segments of DNA.
So bits of mom's chromosome end up on dad's chromosome and vice versa.
You got it. It mixes up the alleles on those chromosomes in new ways, like trading recipe cards between two similar cookbooks, as you said before.
Okay, that's one way to shuffle. What else?
Then there's random orientation or independent assortment. This happens later in meiosis, in metaphase.
How does that work?
The pairs of homologous chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell before they get pulled apart into daughter cells. But how they line up which one of the pair faces which way is completely random for each pair.
Oh, I see. So for each chromosome pair, it's a 50-50 chance which pole the maternal or paternal chromosome will go towards.
Exactly. And since you have multiple pairs of chromosomes, the number of possible combinations of which chromosomes end up in a single sperm or egg cell is huge. It's like randomly dealing cards from several different decks at once.
Wow. Okay, so crossing over mixes alleles on a chromosome, and independent assortment mixes up whole chromosomes into gametes.
Perfectly put. And then there's one more layer. Random fertilization. Meaning any one of the millions of sperm produced has a chance, theoretically, to fertilize any egg that's available. Each sperm and each egg is already genetically unique because of meiosis.
And combining them randomly makes the resulting offspring even more unique.
Exponentially more unique. The chance of two siblings, unless they're identical twins, being genetically identical is practically zero. Sexual reproduction is a variation-generating machine.
So just to recap that bit, mutations are like inventing new words, and sexual reproduction is like writing new sentences and poems using all the words available.
That's a fantastic analogy, yeah. Without that constant generation of variation, natural selection just wouldn't have the raw material it needs to work with. No options to select from.
Okay, clear. Now, let's move to the next piece. Overproduction and competition. You said species make way more offspring than can survive. Why?
It seems to be a common strategy across nature. Think of like a maple tree releasing thousands of seeds or a frog laying hundreds of eggs.
Yeah, most of those seeds won't become trees, and most tadpoles won't become frogs.
Exactly. It's almost like playing the odds. Produce a massive number of offspring and hope that at least a few will make it through all the challenges finding food, avoiding predators, disease, bad weather.
And survive long enough to reproduce themselves.
Precisely. But the inevitable consequence of producing so many offspring in an environment with limited resources...
Competition.
Right. There's just not enough food, water, nesting sites, sunlight, mates, whatever the crucial resources are for everyone. So individuals have to compete.
And this competition isn't just between different species, right? Your materials highlighted competition within the same species.
Yes, intraspecific competition. That's often the most intense competition because members of the same species have virtually identical needs. They're after the exact same food, the same territories, the same mates.
They occupy the same niche, basically.
Exactly. And it's during this intense struggle for existence, this competition, that the differences between individuals really start to matter.
Ah, this is where natural selection kicks in hard.
This is where it really gets going. Those individuals whose traits give them even a slight advantage in the competition.
Maybe they're slightly faster, or slightly better camouflaged, or slightly more resistant to a common disease.
Any of those things. They are more likely to get the resources they need, more likely to survive, and therefore more likely to reproduce and pass on those advantageous traits.
So this is the survival of the fittest idea.
It is, but we have to be a bit careful with that phrase. Fittest here doesn't necessarily mean biggest or strongest. It means the best fit between the organism's traits and its current environment, best adapted to survive and reproduce in that specific context.
Right. Fitness is relative to the environment.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got variation and we've got competition driven by overproduction. Now let's talk more about those selection pressures.
Okay. These are the environmental factors that do the selecting.
Essentially, yes. They are any factors in the environment that affect an organism's chances of survival and reproduction. They can increase the frequency of some traits and decrease the frequency of others.
And the materials divided them into two main types, abiotic and biotic. Let's do abiotic first, non-living.
Correct. Abiotic factors are the non-living physical and chemical components of the environment. So think temperature ranges, amount of sunlight, water availability, soil pH, salinity, natural disasters like floods or volcanic eruptions.
Things that aren't alive but still affect life.
Exactly. And a key thing about many abiotic factors is that their impact can be density independent, meaning they can affect organisms regardless of how crowded the population is. Like a severe drought or a sudden freeze can harm individuals whether there are 10 of them or 10,000.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the biotic factors, the living ones?
Biotic factors involve interactions with other living organisms. This includes things like predators hunting prey, pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi causing disease, competition with other species for resources, that's interspecific competition, and of course competition within the same species, which we already discussed.
And these pressures can be affected by population density.
Often, yes. Disease, for instance, can spread much more easily in a dense population. Competition for food usually gets fiercer as numbers increase. Predation might increase if prey become very abundant and easy to find.
And under biotic factors,
Yeah.
we need to talk about sexual selection specifically, right?
Definitely. Sexual selection is a really fascinating and powerful type of biotic pressure. It's all about competition for mates.
So it's selection that arises because individuals differ in their ability to attract or secure mates.
Precisely. And it generally works in two main ways. There's intrasexual selection.
Intra meaning within.
Right. Competition within one sex, usually males, for access to the other sex. Think male deer locking antlers or male elephant seals fighting for control of a beach. The winners get to mate more.
Okay, so direct competition, what's the other type?
Intersexual selection, inter meaning between. This is often called mate choice.
Where one sex, usually females, chooses who they mate with based on certain characteristics of the other sex.
Exactly. Females might choose males based on things like bright colors, elaborate songs or dances, construction of nests.
Like the peacock's tail we mentioned earlier.
Classic example. Or the elaborate plumage and dances of birds of paradise. These traits might not help the male survive day to day. In fact, they might even be a hindrance.
Make them more obvious to predators, perhaps.
For sure. That bright peacock tail isn't exactly great camouflage. But if females strongly prefer males with those traits,
then those males get to reproduce more, passing on the genes for both the trait and the female preference for it.
You got it. It becomes a trade-off. The reproductive benefit of the exaggerated trait outweighs the survival cost, up to a point. If the tail gets too big and costly, survival drops off, and selection might favor a slightly less extreme version.
So sexual selection can drive the evolution of traits that seem counterintuitive from a purely survival perspective.
Absolutely. It highlights that evolutionary fitness is ultimately about reproductive success.
Okay, so all these selection pressures, whether abiotic, biotic, or sexual, they favor certain traits.
Yeah.
And this leads to adaptations, right?
Yes. An adaptation is a feature. It could be structural, physiological, or behavioral that has evolved because it helps an organism survive and reproduce in its particular environment.
Like the thick fur on a polar bear for warmth.
Perfect example. or the streamlined shape of a fish for moving through water, or a bird's migratory behavior to find food, or better breeding grounds. These are all adaptations.
And this seems really important for natural selection to actually cause evolutionary change. These adaptations, these helpful traits, must be heritable.
Absolutely fundamental. Heritability means the trait has a genetic basis and can be passed from parent to offspring through genes.
So me learning to ride a bike doesn't mean my kids will be born knowing how.
Exactly. That's an acquired characteristic. You learned it, you weren't born with it, and it's not encoded in your sperm or egg cells. It's not heritable.
Whereas something like eye color is determined by genes and is passed down.
Right. Natural selection can only work on heritable variation. If a trait isn't passed on, even if it helps an individual survive, it won't contribute to the evolution of the population over generations. That's a key distinction from older ideas, like Lamarck's idea of inheriting acquired traits.
Got it. Heritability is non-negotiable for evolution by natural selection.
Great.
Now, you mentioned earlier those guppy experiments by John Endler. They seem like a really good way to see these ideas, especially natural and sexual selection, working together.
They really are. Endler's work in Trinidad is a classic study. So male guppies in the streams there show a lot of variation in color patterns, spots, brightness, etc.
Doug?
And female guppies generally prefer to mate with the males that are more brightly colored and have more spots.
Ah, so that's intersexual selection favoring bright colors.
Exactly. But there are also predatory fish in these streams that hunt the guppies. And who do you think is easier for a predator to spot?
The brightly colored males.
Right. So natural selection in the form of predation pressure favors males that are duller and better camouflaged.
So you've got sexual selection pushing for brightness and natural selection pushing for dullness. A conflict.
The direct conflict or a trade-off. And what Endler did was observe guppies in different parts of streams with different levels of predation.
And what did he find?
He found a really clear pattern. In areas with high predation pressure, lots of hungry fish chasing guppies, the male guppies were generally much duller, fewer spots. Camouflage won out.
Makes sense. Survival is paramount.
But in areas with low predation pressure, fewer predators around the male guppies were significantly brighter and more colorful with more spots.
Because the risk of being eaten was lower. So the advantage of attracting females through bright colors became more important.
That's the interpretation. Sexual selection was the stronger force when predation was weak.
Did he test this experimentally?
He did. He did some really elegant experiments. He moved guppies from high predation sites to low predation sites in the wild.
And watch what happened over generations. Guppies reproduce pretty quickly, right?
Relatively quickly, yes. And sure enough, over generations, the male guppies in the newly low predation environment evolved to become brighter and more colorful.
Wow. Evolution in action.
Pretty much. He also did lab experiments, manipulating the gravel color on the bottom of tanks. He found that guppy spot size evolved to better match the background gravel, improving camouflage against that specific background.
So the guppy story is a fantastic illustration of this dynamic balance. Evolution isn't always pushing in one direction. It's often the result of multiple, sometimes opposing selection pressures.
Exactly. It shows the interplay between natural selection, avoiding predators, and sexual selection, attracting mates, beautifully. And it shows that evolution can happen on observable timescales.
Okay, one last point from the materials. They mentioned Darwin's theory of natural selection being a paradigm shift. What's meant by that?
A paradigm shift is just a fancy term for a fundamental change in the basic concepts and experimental practices of a scientific discipline. A major change in thinking.
So, before Darwin and natural selection.
People had ideas about how life changed, sure, but they weren't really hitting the mark. Lamarck's idea of inheriting acquired characteristics was one, but it didn't hold up.
So Darwin's idea, based on variation, inheritance, and differential survival and reproduction,
provided a coherent, testable, and powerful explanation for the vast diversity of life and how organisms become adapted to their environments. It fundamentally changed biology. It replaced the old ways of thinking.
A true revolution in scientific thought.
Absolutely.
Okay, wow, that was quite the dive. Let's try to quickly sum up the key takeaways.
Sounds good. So we started with variation differences between individuals are essential.
Right, and that variation comes from random mutations, the ultimate source, and then gets mixed up hugely by sexual reproduction through meiosis and fertilization.
Then overproduction. More offspring are born than can survive, leading inevitably to
competition, a struggle for limited resources, especially intense within the same species.
And in that competition, selection pressures abiotic biotic, including sexual selection, favor individuals with certain heritable traits.
Heritable being the key word there. Traits passed through genes.
Those individuals survive and reproduce better, passing those advantageous traits on. Over generations, the population evolves, becoming better adapted to its current environment.
And the guppies showed us how natural and sexual selection can interact, sometimes pulling in different directions.
Exactly. And remember, selection acts on the variation that's already there. It doesn't create variation on demand.
Okay, so for Mr. Martin's class listening, as you continue studying biology, keep these ideas in mind. Look at the organisms around you.
Yeah, think about their adaptations. Why does that bird have that beak shape? Why are those leaves shaped like that? What selection pressures might have been at play?
Maybe do a little extra reading on other examples. There are tons of fascinating cases of natural and sexual selection out there.
Understanding natural selection really is key to understanding pretty much all of biology. It's a core concept.
Definitely. And for everyone tuning in, if you found this deep dive helpful or interesting,
Please give us a like.
yeah, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive.
Leave us a comment too. Any questions you have, pop them below.
And please, tell your friends, tell your classmates, tell anyone who might be interested in understanding how life evolves.
Thanks for listening.